We did a big study. We showed that financial exploitation has the same impact on depression and anxiety as physical abuse. They were equally depressed. So they beat themselves up over this. They pay in money and then they pay in emotions. There's a third way to pay, though, in a bad way, a third cost, and that's taking away too much autonomy, because then they pay in freedom.
Welcome to the NCEA's Conversations on Aging and Justice podcast and our series on ethics in elder mistreatment. Join us in examining ethical dilemmas in elder abuse prevention and intervention while considering principles of autonomy, consent, and justice for older adults. Elder financial exploitation is one of the fastest growing and most prevalent forms of elder mistreatment, encompassing both elder financial abuse and financial fraud and scams. Elder financial exploitation results in an estimated $28.3 billion in losses each year. Beyond the economic costs, elder financial exploitation may also be accompanied by emotional and psychological injury. In our efforts to protect older adults from financial exploitation and related harms, we must also keep in mind the importance of respecting older adults' agency, autonomy, and independence. Our second episode in this series features Debbie Deem and Dr. Acierno. Debbie is a retired FBI victim specialist of 16 years who currently serves as an intervention coach for victims of transnational fraud. Dr. Acierno is Vice Chair for Veterans Affairs and Executive Director of the Trauma and Resilience Center at UT Health Houston, and lead researcher for the seminal U.S. Elder Mistreatment Prevalence Study. Together, they delve into the ethical dilemmas faced by professionals and family members when intervening in cases of financial exploitation, and why conventional interventions, which may be over-corrective, may sometimes do more harm than good. We're excited for you to hear this conversation.
Hello, Debbie. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk to you, and I appreciate the article you sent me on financial fraud and exploitation. It's an issue that hits close to home for two reasons. For me, one, I have done some research in this field, and on the clinical side, direct a clinic where we have people who are victims of financial exploitation and fraud. And two, I have older parents who I'm trying to help navigate the current, ocean of fraud and exploitation opportunists out there.
And I deal with this issue daily. I've probably seen 6 victims in the last 4 days, and out of those, 4 of them, I think, are people that probably should be considered for having some kind of monitoring or control of their finances, and the system's just not there to do it. Can you share more about your experience with your father?
My dad he's 83, he's in very good condition. He's a semi-professional or now professional singer out doing gigs 2 or 3 nights a week. But he tends to be a good target for financial exploitation. And the question is, do we educate him as to these scams and schemes? Does that do anything? Do we try and control his finances? Do we take away his autonomy? That's the ethical question. Beneficence versus autonomy. Do we want to do what helps the person, or do we want to respect their independence? And in my dad's situation, he's financially and with it, cognitively with it, but he seems to be very vulnerable in being defrauded. And it is targeted toward older adults and their vulnerabilities. I'll give you an example. He got the old, hey, this is your grandson, Dom. I just had a bad accident. I hit a woman and her kid in their car, and now I'm in jail. I need you to meet the Uber driver and give him $8,000 cash so that he can bring this to my attorney. My attorney will be calling you in a few minutes to validate this. And then he gets a call within 30 seconds from a person saying they're an attorney. And everyone listening to this is saying, this is obviously a scam. But in the height of the emotions, worried about his grandson, worried if he has injured an innocent child, worried about all these things, and they knew what to do. If you hear this playing out, it's a scam. Put $8,000 in a box and give it to an Uber driver, and the attorney will call. Well, he still to this day is not entirely sure that was a scam, despite all the evidence, because they were so convincing and they knew his grandson's name and they knew the type of car he was driving. And I tried to explain this is all publicly available. Before they make the call, they'll get a few facts. Now, after the first episode, and there's a couple of others with acquaintances giving him bad checks and things, he didn't want to give me control of his finances, but he gave me what I consider the middle ground. He gave me monitoring access. So anytime he has a bank withdrawal, anytime he uses credit card, I get a text. Is it intrusive? Yes. My dad is a shopaholic. It used to be Home Shopping Network. Now it's Amazon. So I might get 10, 15 texts a day. But I got this text just as I was boarding a plane that there was a $1,500 overseas charge. And I called him up and I said, what did you just buy for $1,500? Because I don't care if he uses his money. I just want to make sure it's him. And he said nothing. And I said, you didn't use your credit card? No. Has anybody called you to use your credit card? No. 15-minute conversation. And then I asked one more time. I said, Dad, have you gotten a call in the past half an hour from anybody other than me? Oh, yeah. Yeah, the credit card was trying to stop a fraud. And I was like, didn't I just ask? He goes, well, you said trying to defraud me. That was the fraud control. And I said, you didn't happen to give them a code, did you? And he goes, yes, he asked for the code. And it took a few minutes for him to say, oh, you think that was a prankster? He goes, oh, well, it seemed like he was calling from the credit card. Anyway, because I was monitoring this in real time, I was able to immediately call the credit card company and stop the charge. That doesn't work with bank withdrawals, though. It doesn't work with Zelle. It doesn't work with wires. I, who does elder mistreatment research and financial exploitation research, has this situation going on. So it's a range of things. And yet he won't order wine with dinner at a restaurant because he thinks it's a ripoff.
What are the ethical issues you're seeing? And is just monitoring enough in the situation of your father? Or what ethically, given that whole thing of, independence and self-determination to make mistakes versus that need to protect,
Yeah.
versus the assets being depleted over time, and then you're responsible or the government's responsible for their care. Where are you now in terms of your father as far as this ethical dilemma that so
Yeah.
many families, APS workers, and others are dealing with?
It's an ethical dilemma when there's two good things you want to do, right? If somebody has tripped and fallen and they need your help, that's beneficence. You're being benevolent. You help them. There's no conundrum. But if there's a situation where somebody needs your help, but the way you help them might cause other harm, then you have an ethical dilemma. And this one, to use the ethical principles that they teach in school, beneficence versus autonomy. Autonomy is his right to control his own money and do his own things. Beneficence is us not wanting him to be taken advantage of. And so there's a cost to any ethical dilemma, right? And in our cases, okay, he's clearly consistently being taken advantage of. $50,000 in bad checks from the same acquaintance who meets him at the bank to pay him and then convinces him to take another bad check in lieu of the payment. I mean, and you talk to my father, you would never think he would be fooled this way. But people play on his soft-heartedness, right?
I've come to just a difference in how I approached this probably even 5 years ago when I was working for the FBI as a victim specialist to the work I do now, where daily I am seeing 2 and 3 victims a day, and working with their families. And having worked with some of these folks for 2 years and seeing the consistent bad decisions that are being made over money that's not lost, this is money that is being stolen from them. I
Yeah.
think reframing the words that we use in this, I don't like to use the word scam and I don't like to use the word money lost. This is money stolen. And I think there's certain protections for people if it's done by somebody local. We have restraining orders, we have other kinds of devices and things to hopefully stop that.
You said it's not money lost, it's money stolen. But that is not how the criminal
They
justice
don't
system
see it that
authorities
way.
look at it. When I reported the repeated bounce checks, one of the municipalities had an elder fraud division. They said it sounds like a bad financial decision rather than defrauding. And I said, well, then can you explain how fraud would ever exist if you say that it's just a bad financial decision, other than somebody holding a gun to his head, which is no longer fraud, right? Now that's called strong arm robbery. So you're absolutely right, but that plays into the autonomy versus beneficence, right? And so in my father's thing, there is a psychological cost to my father, both from being defrauded. We did a big study. We showed that financial exploitation has the same impact on depression and anxiety as physical abuse. They were equally depressed. So they beat themselves up over this. They pay in money and then they pay in emotions. There's a third way to pay, though, in a bad way, a third cost, and that's taking away too much autonomy, because then they pay in freedom. So they've already lost money. They've already lost their psychological well-being because they feel bad. Do you also want to take away their freedom to make bad decisions?
We're not denying them their freedom. It's actually just their ability to make certain financial decisions about
Well,
themselves. And it's not autonomy given a whole. They can still go places. They can still meet with people in real life that they want to meet with. They can still do a lot of their daily activities. What some of these suggestions are saying is there might be needs for more protections financially. And I think some of the studies I love, and it's a term I don't hear used very much, but Dr. Lax and Dukan had that age-associated financial vulnerability. There's other factors in this, but it's these patterns of these bad relationships even. And I'm talking specifically in terms of, again, of these remote criminals, because I've been doing a deep dive because I have so many families right now that have been able to stop the hemorrhaging going on within their families, and social workers where there is no families. So I'm having to do kind of a deep dive right now in capacity declarations and what's that process. And I'm getting all kinds of notices from people around the country saying, just to talk to an attorney about guardianship or conservatorship would cost me $3,000 to $4,000. I don't
yeah.
have that.
But here's the problem. And I will, dementia is a diminished cognitive capacity. And what they're showing in their imaging, their MRI studies, is that when you try to trick or defraud in a study a younger person, a certain area of the brain lights up to detect it. And in the older person, for whatever reason, a culture of trust, growing up believing in other people, whatever, age, it doesn't, they don't light up that area of the brain. There's literally a problem. But other areas are just fine. And that's why it's very difficult. And I will push back on what you said a little bit. Taking away my father's ability to invest his money. So he was a college professor, but all of his income came from stock market investments. So that's his livelihood. And now he's a shopaholic, not expensive things like $6 things, $7. He loves Amazon and Temu and all these little things but taking away his ability to do things when he wants to, gas in the car, that is a third cost that I don't think you can easily get rid of. If I were to take control of his finances so that he couldn't make any decisions without going through me, he would feel his freedoms were impinged
And
tremendously.
also, limiting the damage, I think, is one of the ways to go. Trusted contacts on accounts, both retirement as well as banking
Yeah.
accounts. I think right now, though, what I see is the whole system is really failing this. And part of that, again, the whole issue of capacity and dementia, a lot of the capacity kinds of things, from what I'm reading in the history of this, were developed in the early 1990s or around in that time period. We didn't even have the internet then. Our whole capacity framework of determining who's competent and who isn't is based on a model from the 20th century, and we're in the 21st century where it's a different world.
We need mitigation steps that are in between
Exactly.
total conservatorship. So, for example, limits on credit card spending per day without a secondary co-signature would be a great idea. Limits on bank withdrawals per day without a secondary co-signature. And you would have to set these relevant to the individual. There are some people for whom $200 a month is a drop in the bucket, and other people means they won't eat. And so it would have to be set, but to give the courts, to give the families another tool. And I don't like the idea, and I've seen it in too many cases where the family gets conservatorship over the individual and then squanders all their money. Because we have to remember the number one perpetrators of elder mistreatment are family members. So I don't necessarily want people to take the money away from the older adult. And I don't necessarily want them to take control of choice, what they want to spend their money on. For example, no, you can't go out to dinner. You've already gone out to dinner twice this week. That would be infantilizing to the point of abuse, I think. But what we do want to do is find some middle ground.
Right. And I see so many people that don't have families or they don't have that person there. So it's literally Adult Protective Services and thankfully in my county and a few others, me. I mean, and that's where I've been able to follow families for 1, 2, 3 years, where I don't think many people are doing that.
No, I don't know of anybody.
Amount of
That's just
time.
amazing.
I'm doing it, but I have many of these chronic victims that don't have family, that don't have someone stepping up. And it's devastating. And what's happened, I have 3 people about 6 months ago in my own county that were homeless because of these kinds of frauds.
A person who has lost everything and is homeless, we are compelled to intervene. Well, not only do we have justification to intervene, at that point, beneficence trumps autonomy. We have to get that person off the street, right? That's an easier ethical dilemma to resolve.
The system has kind of ignored those folks, especially if they're still involved in participating and being manipulated to continue these kinds of frauds.
Could you expand on that? So, because this is an important point that I ran into. You said if the person is continuing to engage with the perpetrator.
I got 2 responses today, just in cases I have. One was a social worker, and I made a report this week based on someone temporarily living in a very cheap hotel. The landlord has basically been letting her live there for 2 months with no money. She's had her home, her car stolen. She believes that she's involved with, I'll just mention certain princes from the Middle East, dealings with celebrity musicians, investment frauds, now lottery. I've been working with her for probably 2 years now.
But when you talk to her, does she seem to be either psychotic or delusional?
I would say definitely probably delusional. Her life is what she does on the phone. She's older.
Exactly.
And this is what I see with so many of the older people. Their whole life, their relationships, their reasons for living, their reasons to get up in the morning are based on who they're dealing with on the phone.
These people are calling them. It's not so clear cut. If they're imagining these things, great, we can take away their autonomy, we can conserve it, but they're not imagining them. People are trying to rip them off.
These are all imposters. But I don't think education works at that level then for a lot of these kind of folks. And unfortunately, the banks, law enforcement, Adult Protective Services, I've probably filed 7 or 8 Adult Protective Services on some of the people. And law enforcement often might take a report, but nothing happens after that. And they file a report maybe with IC3 and they don't understand it's just a database. And it doesn't mean that an FBI agent or somebody is not going to come out in the next 2 or 3 days. Banks may get so fed up, they just close the account and put them in check systems. Then they can no longer even, have a banking account with a really good bank.
We only have overcorrections as opposed to infrastructure and supports. So in the case that you talked about, we need to think more of how to implement those things with, you had mentioned limiting how much money somebody can use on a credit card or limiting how much money somebody can use in a bank withdrawal. That's very rarely a court-ordered thing. It's very rarely something that you can access inexpensively. Like you said, if it costs $15,000 to go through this process, what family is going to be able to do that, right? And so we're back to the ethical dilemma. What do we do? Do we limit how much freedom our older adult relative has to spend their own money that they earned to protect them in the future? Or do we just let them go? It's their money, and then we don't, so where is that balance point?
I think we need much more intervention at the early stage. So recently I had a referral from my Adult Protective Services, and it was a man that had $1.2 million that he had stolen in a publisher's clearinghouse fraud. I don't think he'd ever been approached by Adult Protective Services before. In my county, they contact me if it's a transnational fraud and the victim is willing to talk to me, and I will work with them the rest of their lives, as long as I've got my capacity to do so. So doing an intervention with him, and I showed him an article that said I was the FBI's secret weapon on lottery and sweepstakes fraud and romance frauds. He saw that. He still wasn't convinced because someone was impersonating the FBI saying that they were going to take his home. He was ready to get out a second mortgage on this to help pay that final payment. Me talking to him and showing him the Publishers Clearinghouse site that said you never have to pay money in advance, you never have to, they will never call you, all these kind of things.
Yeah.
It didn't really register with him. It wasn't until I suggested, because I could see the fear in his soul, and he had no family around. I said, why don't you go to the local FBI or call them and have them tell you that this person is not real who's threatening to take your house. And it wasn't until law enforcement gave him that response that wasn't really the FBI, that the next day when I talked to him, he wasn't suicidal anymore.
But think about the intervention that you had to do. That's not that
right.
That is scary.
That is not available to people at that early age. And he's fine now, and I hope he will be. He's going to be at risk for recovery frauds. But on that same token, I'm seeing, like I said, 4 people out of the 6 I've seen recently where I've been working with them for 1 or 2 years, and they're just not learning from their mistakes.
That you described what's called a stepped care model, right? Let me break down what you did so that it might actually be a model that could be used going forward. One, you educated, and that helps some people, but not the people who are convinced that this person is real because they've already gone past the education levels, protections. And you intervened with law enforcement. You convinced him to go talk to an outside person who has no vested interest in this. He going to the police. He went to the FBI or the police, and they talked to him. Now, that would be wonderful if we could get people to do, but how many law enforcement agencies are going to listen to an older adult coming in and, who's going to sit down and listen to him? You'd have already translated everything for him, but that's a second level. The third or fourth level is when we actually consider taking away somebody's autonomy. And that's the point I want to make. We don't want to jump to the sledgehammer of you make bad financial decisions, you make stupid financial decisions, you make exploitate me financial decisions. We're going to take all your control away because the psychological impact of that is devastating. It's like taking the keys away from the car of a person who is isolated and that's their only connection to society. Yes, they're too dangerous to drive, but if you don't substitute transportation methods for the one you're taking away, you're going to have a depressed person. Same thing with this. If you take away their finances with a sledgehammer approach, instead of doing what you did, which is a tiered approach, you did step 1, step 2, step 3, and you didn't have to go to step 4, take away the finances. That's a great model. We have to think about how can we scale that up.
But that's only also temporary with him. I don't know where he'll be 3 months from now.
We can stop 100% if we don't let anybody over age 60 ever have control of their money again. But that's not the way you want to do it.
I don't think that's what's happening in transnational fraud cases, because I think for many, these people, I call them invisible victims and invisible crimes. I don't think a lot of our justice systems or even our civil courts are seeing these victims so much. I think they're really so apart from our criminal justice systems, our probate systems, all of these kinds of systems at this point. They're just kind of being ignored. We also have to have a family view of this, because oftentimes it's the family that's going to end up being responsible for these people or not. And I think finding what to replace that behavior or that relationship or that reason to get up in the morning is so critical. And we're so lacking in those kinds of things for people.
And I'm going to push back saying about transnational. People who are vulnerable to transnational are also vulnerable to more local or acquaintance-based stuff. So my dad's a perfect example. Transnational was the one who did the credit card. Local was the one who did the Uber. And then acquaintance was the one who asked him for money at the bank after he had already passed a bad check for 6 months. So once you're vulnerable to one, you're vulnerable to all. I think that what you're doing illustrates a potential approach, because the current approach, like I said, is a sledgehammer. You wait till the person is so bad that you can take away all financial control or they have no more money. Great, problem solved. Now they're destitute. Now, in my father's case, monitoring for him was better than taking away all control of his finances, which I wouldn't have been able to do anyway because he's too cognitively with it. But if he had somebody that I could have said, Dad, the sheriff's office has this liaison or this elder fraud expert. You don't believe me, even though I'm an elder fraud expert because I'm your kid. Call this person and bounce it by them. And then you'll see if they think this is real or if this is fraudulent.
I call myself Coach Debbie. I'm Coach Debbie on fraud. And for a lot of my victims, sometimes they will contact me before they make that decision if they've been solicited in some way. But I have so many that do not do that. Whether they've got support, whether they're highly educated, all these kind of things. I think something happens with some older folks.
We got to go to monitoring for them. You have to skip the earlier step.
But all right, sometimes there's no one to monitor for
okay, well then they're going to be defrauded until they have nothing.
Well, and that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, because there's no intervening system. What you could do is have an intervening thing where you simply limit how much somebody can spend in a certain day, but then the person will just drain them over longer periods of time. But that's autonomy. We have to allow people to make bad decisions.
And that's where I think that we do have laws now. And California just changed their conservatorship laws to actually allow for now a pattern of financial, we'll call it poor decision making or having money stolen on these kind of situations. It's actually a factor now that can be considered in conservatorship kinds of things, and even temporary.
My fear of that is conservatorship is often expensive and itself malicious. So we have to be very careful with that.
But also there are temporary conservatorships. And I know one man.
I like that idea.
Said I was conserved, and I really pissed off. And I said, yeah, it must be like you're kind of on financial probation. And he said, yeah, that's kind of what it is. And I said, well, perhaps though, in a year from now, if you show them that you're making, you're not involved with these fraud perpetrators that are promising you all these things. Mm-hmm. Maybe if you show them in a year that you can monitor your accounts, that you can do safer decision making and who you in your life, you can get up.
This is called temporary conservatorship. I've never heard of that, but that's a great idea.
So again, I like this idea of temporary kind of conservatorships with, and again, it's probably anybody, an APS worker, file for this now. It doesn't have to be a family member, and you don't have to have an attorney. It's a special kind of provision.
I want to point out that that's still a severe implementation. It's still a smaller sledgehammer. But let me summarize what you talked about. One, you try and familiarize a person with the scheme. Two, you try and bring in outside people, maybe sheriff, maybe FBI, maybe family members. Three, you empower the family or guilt them into being a little bit more a part of the person's financial decision-making life, and to replace the emotional support that this person's getting from the fraudster with maybe family emotional support. Four, you maybe implement a monitoring pattern where you watch all the finances. Five, you implement something that might limit the daily expenditures. And six, you have a temporary conservatorship. And then seven would be complete conservatorship. These are the sort of the range that you've talked about and that we've experienced a little bit on my father's side.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Ethics in Elder Mistreatment. Subscribe to our channel on YouTube or Spotify so you don't miss future conversations exploring ethical dilemmas in elder abuse prevention and intervention.